I'm from Chisago County, Republicans. I've been with the party for 23 years, third of my life. Just gradually get involved and then more and more extensively. So I've done just about everything in the party, and I've been asked to speak to you tonight on the State Central Committee. Now that's not a spine-tingling subject, but I hope to be able to present it to you a little bit better than the tastelessness of seaweed. It's very important in the politics, and so we have to be studious to learn, but I'll be talking tonight about statutes and constitutions and bylaws. And that can be pretty dry for lots of people, but it is very, very essential for us. Now, I might get coughing tonight, and pardon me for doing that, and I might have to leave if I get in a coughing fit so you guys don't hear it. So I hope I can handle it here. State Central Committee is a committee of the Minnesota political parties. And you see there in the bold, State Central Committee, but we also have a state convention and we have state executive committee. So we'll be talking about these three bodies tonight. This is true for the MNGOP, which is also known as RPM. So if I talk about MNGOP as Minnesota GOP or RPM as Republican Party Minnesota. This is also true for the Democrats, because it applies to them just as much as it applies to the Republicans. And go to the DFL website, poke around, look at it, look at their constitution, and you'll recognize the things that I'm talking about tonight are in there. Now, before learning about the State Central Committee, let's actually learn about a Minnesota political party. That's important, so we'll back off here just a bit. President George Washington warned against political parties. He thought it was divisive, but the federal Constitution actually itself was the center of the creation of political parties. The Federalists wanted a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists wanted strong states. And we have states' rights people. I'm a states' rights person. Very, very much. Federalists, these are three examples of Federalists, and the next is the Anti-Federalists are examples, and I think we have high regard for all these men in many, many ways. But back then in the later 1700s, they were at each other's throats in many ways. So two parties developed immediately after the federal Constitution and over the Constitution, and specifically how strong should the federal government be over the states. The Federalist Party faded away when Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1801 to be president, and he was the Anti-Federalist. So the Federal Party died, but federalism did not die. There's a proper federalism. We are a federation of states, very, very properly so, but there's also an improper federalism. And that's what we're experiencing today more and more, where the federal government wants to take over. And the Anti-Federalists had just literally dreaded what has become today. It's tyranny. The Federalists themselves would actually be dismayed. If John Adams came back today, the Federalist, he would be absolutely shocked at how tyrannical things have become, and he would have to actually say, this is worse than King George was. Now, the parties continued, and after 1800, there's always something over which to divide, and certainly over candidates. Now, as the party tried to get to their candidates elected, they developed their party organizations and the party structures over the next few decades. The Jacksonian Democrats were founded in 1820s, and the Whig Party was founded in 1834 in opposition to them. By 1832, national conventions were being held for the parties to nominate their presidential candidates, And the states had been holding conventions for their governors prior to that. Settlers here coming to this part of the Northwest Territory brought their political beliefs and party associations with them. So Minnesota had Jacksonian Democrats and Whigs that were in this part of the Northwest Territory in the 1820s to 1850s. So as an extension of the Jacksonian Democrats, the Democrat Party of Minnesota was already in existence in Minnesota when it became a territory in 1849. The Whig Party was in steep decline, and the Republican Party was founded in Ripon, Wisconsin, back in 1854. That's over there near Fond du Lac in the eastern part of Wisconsin. And the Minnesota Republican Party was founded in 1854 on July 4th, and they held their convention in St. Anthony in 1855, and that was Minnesota Territory before the state. So in Minnesota, political parties preceded statehood, preceded our state constitution, preceded our state statutes. We were the 32nd state in 1858. And this is probably true for the bulk of states other than the original 13 colonies. So the organization and structure of the Minnesota political parties existed for more than 100 years, and then that structure was memorialized in state statutes in 1975. Very, very recently. This is the current statute reference where you can go. If anybody wants these slides, I can give them to you in the format of PowerPoint. When you go to that reviser statute link there, this is what you see. And right there in subdivision 2, you see State Central Committee. Go ahead, and this is how it's reading. There's subject to the control of the state convention, the general management of the affairs of the state party is vested in the party's State Central Committee. Now, what does all that mean? We'll be talking about that. Then at that same location, you see the history down there at the bottom. And this is typical in statutes where it gives you a history so you can go back and look at it. And you go to the next slide. This is the enlargement. So in 1975, those 4 subdivisions, along with some others, were actually introduced. And when you go to this history link, again, you can click on this and it'll take you back to the actual bill that was introduced and that brought in these provisions. So none of this existed prior to 1975. The 3 components of a political party there on the left-hand side, which is true for the Democrats as well as the Republicans. So go back, the structure was memorialized in statutes in 1975. The structure and organization of the party actually predates 1975. It was practiced for years, over 100 or thereabout. We don't know exactly all the details of it. I have a 1965 GOP Constitution. I have a 1937 GOP Constitution. I was researching in the Minnesota History Center years ago and just accidentally ran onto it. And you can also find a DFL Constitution of 1969 that's online as well. So all those constitutions refer to these 3 components prior to the statute going into effect. So this is again the 4 subdivisions that we'll be talking about, and I'll bring a screen up to enlarge it. So the final authority over the affairs of each major political party is vested in the state's convention, the first component, and it's at the call of the State Central Committee, the second component. Of course, the more I talk, the worse it's gonna get. Okay, can switch again. The second subdivision is the State Central Committee, and switch slides. Subject to the control of the State Convention, the general management of the affairs of the party is vested in the State Central Committee. Again, you have those two relationships. Now you have another one here, the State Executive Committee. That will have charge of the administration of the party's affairs, subject to the direction of the State Convention and the State Central Committee. So now we have these three bodies that are interrelated. And here is an actual structure. This is set by statute. It was practiced prior to 1975 and memorialized in 1975. So the State Convention, you almost always meet in May of the election year. That body is the final authority. It's legislative. It makes law. It makes policy. Then on the right-hand side, you have the State Central Committee, and that is administrative or executive, and that is subject to the State Convention. And then subject to the State Central is the State Executive Committee, and it's also subject to the State Convention. So those three bodies are what we're going to be talking about tonight. Legislative power is the convention. It makes the policy law, and executive puts into practice all the law and policy that the convention sets. These are the breakouts of the responsibilities of each of the three here, and we'll go to the next slide and we'll enlarge it. So the State Convention, you endorse candidates, you elect Republican National Committee delegates, you elect the presidential electors, that's for the electoral college, and the convention sets policy in the platform and then also adopts a constitution. State Central elects the executive officers on the executive team. He elects national committee members, two of them, a man and a woman. It manages all the party affairs and property. It has a fiduciary responsibility. And it calls conventions. Nobody else can call these conventions. And formerly it elected a treasurer. Now we don't. And it formally adopted a budget, and it does no longer do that. And then the State Executive Committee, their job is to support and endorse candidates, the day-to-day operation, and then they handle legal matters. Now, there's probably other little things that each of these groups do that I have not summarized. So each of these three committees are very important, and so we need to elect delegates here locally who are very responsible to the state conventions, to CD conventions, and to the State Central Committee. Everything is driven out of the BPOUs, so we need to be responsible. Now that's a summary of the statutes. Let's look now at the RPM Constitution. And the Constitution has to be consistent with the statutes. You see there the three components of the party. The red arrow, it shows there the decreasing authority. And then at the bottom you see there's about 140 BPOUs in the state. That number can change because some groups, like in Chisago County, Wyoming is now split into two, and Chisago is just now split into 3. So we've got 3 new precincts, but the BPOUs can be a county, it could be a Senate district, or even a legislative House district. So you can have a little bit of change in that. We have 87 counties. In the Twin Cities, there's a lot of Senate districts. Now, go back. The BPOUs elect delegates to the state conventions. There's 2,200 delegates at state convention. They also elect delegates to the 8 CD conventions, and again, the 2,200 delegates are split among those 8 conventions. The BPOUs are federations of precincts. The CDs are federations of BPOUs. The state conventions are federations of BPOUs, but the state central committee are federations of CDs. We relate to the state central on the basis of a CD. And there's 340 delegates there. The state central then is the group that elects the state executive committee. There's 3 officers. There's 8 vice chairs, 1 from each of the CDs that elect them. And then there's some chair appointees. Okay. Now, use this, kind of freeze this into your mind. You have 3 components, and you have 3 different levels. So far we've been talking about the state level. You have a convention, you have a central committee, and you have an executive committee. Then at the CD level, you have the same 3 groups, and then at the BPOU, you have the same 3 groups. So there's 9 bodies that we'll be talking about here. There's 3 components and 3 different levels. You notice that the first 2 columns, these are vested with authority. One is vested with legislative authority, one is vested with executive authority. And then the executive committee is not vested. It has limited and enumerated power. All this breakout is designed to reduce tyranny. The same is true for the CD level, and the next is true for the BPOU level as well. So it's designed to reduce tyranny at the BPOU level just as much. What does vested mean? It means to be endowed with authority, which is bestowed on the body completely, permanently, and inalienably. You can advance. To vest is to endow. And I'll take this right out of our Declaration of Independence. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. These are given to us by God. They're not inherent in us, and they're inalienable rights. You cannot take life away from us that God has given unless you totally violate God. To be vested is to be clothed with a robe. So think in terms of a vest, vestments. This is what is being talked about. So we, the people, clothe the convention body with the robe of full authority. So we, the people, start it all. And in the statute, we, the people of Minnesota, clothe that convention body with full authority. It's given by the people. It's not inherent power, but it's inalienable power. So when I go into a convention, I'm clothed with something that's not my own. The state of Minnesota has empowered me to be part of that, or empowered the body to exist. By statute, it's then given to us and identified, and then by vote, you or I are elected to be a delegate to that body, and we walk into that room, we put on a robe of authority, and we have a ability and responsibility to vote for the party, the best of the, for the party, not for ourselves. So we need to take that seriously. Now, the executive committee in all these three different levels is not vested. It does not have inherent power. It has not been given any power other than what is given to it in the Constitution. It's enumerated and limited. You remember the U.S. federal Constitution. It's enumerated, limited power. And the executive committee is very much that way. The powers are also alienable. By Constitution, you could give the executive committee certain power, and the next group of people could come along and say, no, we're taking that away from you. So, as an example, I pointed out to you that the state central committee used to create a budget. That's now simply in the hands of the executive committee. So that was changed some 10, 12 years ago at least. There's separation of powers. The state convention cannot elect officers or national committee members. Those are elected by the state central. Separation of powers are built into the federal government, very, very essential in order to keep tyranny down. You can, yeah. The state central cannot endorse candidates except in certain circumstances, certain situations, rare. That's the state central or state convention that does that. The state convention cannot call its own convention. It's all called by the state central. There's a separation of powers. The state convention cannot spend money. The party funds are the purview of the state central committee and the executive committee, and they have to file a campaign finance report. So the state convention does not handle money. So the state central committee is statutory managing body, and it's the legally responsible body. Again, referring to subdivision 1, the final authority is the party's convention, and it's called at the call of the state central committee. Very, very important. You got to get them to act in order to call. And by statute, they have to call at least one convention in an election year. So they cannot say, we're not going to do that. Back up, sorry. The state convention shall be held at time and place as the state central committee may determine. So the state central that happened on August 12th, they set the state conventions in May of next year. And they've got to do that well in advance so you have planning. Now let's go to the separation of powers at other levels here. So at the CD level, again, you have the three components at the CD level. And the CD, there's 8 of them in the state. We are in CD 8. And there's, I think it's 21 BPOUs that are in that group. And we together make up the CD 8. The congressional district conventions by Constitution here now, they're going to be held annually at the call of the state executive committee or the committees of the respective congressional district. So one of the 8, each one of the 8 have to call their own conventions. The congressional district committee shall determine the place of holding the congressional district conventions. That's in the RPM Constitution. Then here in the CD8 Constitution, each of the CDs are going to have a constitution that the language might vary a little bit, but it's all has to be consistent with the state party constitution. So the district convention shall be held annually at the call of the district full committee, and the place of holding it will be determined by the district full committee. Now, the district CD committee, Congressional District Committee, is not the CD Executive Committee. The CD committee is the executive committee plus the representatives from each of the BPOUs, and it's known as the full committee. In CD8, in 2 CDs in the state, it's known as the Central Committee. And Central takes you back to the state central. So they use that terminology rather than the word full. So there's separation of powers. In the RPM Constitution, Article 9, Section 1, it talks about Congressional District Committee. Section 2 talks about Congressional District Executive Committee. You can't mix these two up. They are 2 separate ones. Then the CD8 convention, Article 1 or Article 3 talks about the full committee, and Article 4 talks about the executive committee. Again, you can't mix them up. So here's the same structure at the CD level that is at the state level, except I've just changed the terminology here to the CD. And then the one thing that you'll notice is different is the convention here elects the executive committee, whereas back on the state components, the full committee or the central committee is the one that elects the executive committee. So that's essentially the only difference. Okay, you can advance. A CD convention is not a convention for the executive committee. And the executive committees tend to forget about this. It is a convention for the BPOU delegates and nothing more. All the BPOUs in the full committee are the ones who call that convention. The BPOUs delegates plus the executive committee together, those 2 bodies form the full committee, and they're the ones who call the convention. It is not the executive committee that calls the convention, according to the Constitution. In practice, that might not happen. Okay, let's go down to the BPOU level. This is for all of us here locally. Again, we have 3 components in our organization: the convention, the BPOU committee, and then the executive committee. And the BPOU committee can be known as the full committee. In state constitution, it's known as the BPOU committee, and here locally in your constitution, it's known as the county committee, and that is very true in many, many places. In a Senate district, it can't be known as a county committee, so it's known as a BPOU committee because it's not a county bound group. It might cross boundaries. Now, this is out of the RPM Constitution. The BPOU convention shall be held annually at the call of the Congressional District Committee or the BPOU committee. So the BPOU committee is what calls a local convention. Now, what is the BPOU committee? It's in that middle column. It is not the executive committee. It is that full committee, which includes the executive committee, but the executive committee alone cannot call it. Again, here is the same structure at a BPOU level with the 3 different components as you have at a CD level and as you have at the state level. So while the 3 components are there, at each different level, you have a little bit of different responsibilities in some of the like the executive committee certainly has more responsibility at the state level than it does at a BPOU level. Again, the BPOU committee is not the BPOU executive committee. It is the executive committee plus the representatives of the precincts. So if you leave the precincts out of it, you're not operating with the county committee or the full committee, you're operating simply with the executive committee. A BPOU convention is not a convention for the executive committee here locally. It is a convention for the precinct delegates to make decisions. All the precincts in the full committee are the ones that call the convention. So there's separation of CD powers, the management of the affairs of the party when the 8th Congressional District shall be vested again, that term, in the full committee, subject to the objectives of the Constitution and direction of the district convention. So the separation of powers in the CD8 Constitution, again, the executive committee shall administer and manage the party affairs within the district between meetings of the full district full committee and shall make recommendations to the district full committee on questions or policy, appointments, or other matters. Now, when you read that, which group has more power, the executive committee or the full committee? What is the executive committee limited to in the CD? Making recommendations. They're not there to run the show. Because if they do, they've just eliminated every representative from all the other BPOUs that make up the federation of BPOUs in the CD. This is very, very clear on paper. To get this put into practice is very difficult because tyranny wants to take hold and the executive committee thinks, oh, we've been elected, and so it's up to us. Well, your BPOU representatives have been elected as well. So they just tend to forget about that. So separation of powers, very, very important. It's very easy not to practice what the Constitution establishes. Executive committees are limited in power, but easily overstep their responsibilities. The full committee is vested with all the power and authority, and the executive committee is not vested. It has never been given a robe of authority. It has been given a list of enumerated responsibilities, which can be taken away or can be added to. Again, rule of law is very, very important in our Republican form of government, our federal order that has been given to us. The exercise of power within the authority structure is defined by a constitution, and it's not the exercise of power at the whim of a majority. I'll give you an example. At the last State Central Committee, somebody made a motion to remove the chair. Well, the Constitution says, yeah, you can do that with 2/3 of a vote, 2/3 of the members, but you've got to have a process. So there's always due process involved in rule of law as well. And so the Constitution made it clear that you had to go through this process in order to actually accomplish that. So even among the Republicans, the whim of the majority can be very, very detrimental. And we have to be guided by rule of law. And this is a good example. We have Republican form of government. In the small r case, I should have put that as small r. That is, we're a republic. The federal government, it's, as an example, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. And at the state level, Minnesota government, the stability of a Republican form of government is right in actually in our Constitution in Article 13, Section 1. So Minnesota state is a republic. And then the Republican Party of Minnesota is also a republic. It's governed by Republican principles, as outlined in our Republican Constitution. And we've been going through a list of some of the Republican principles that we've been talking about here tonight, and there's others as well. But we are a republic, and then right down into our local BPOU level, we're actually a republic. Not, obviously, a political republic is not a governing kind of republic like the state is or a federal government is, but we're governed by the same kind of principles. Our founding fathers and our forefathers set up all these things very, very thoughtfully and gave us very, very good order. And this order goes way back and was memorialized in the state statute in 1975. So right here in Isuana County, you are a republic. You're operating on the basis of Republican principles. And they are actually outlined in your Constitution. And don't lose that Republican form in your BPOU. You've got to practice the RPM Constitution because you cannot be out of step with it. You have to be in sync with it. If you're not in sync with it, the state party would say, wait a minute, as a local chapter, you got to get in line in that form. And even the RNC rules can require, for example, if you're going to be an RNC delegate, you've got to be elected. You can't have it automatically because you hold a certain office in your BPOU. You've got to be actually elected. So know how to be in authority and under authority. And under authority, I'm going to say of the RPM Constitution because that ultimately is, you've got to submit to that. That's the guideline. If your own local constitution is out of line with it, you don't want to be in conformity to your own local constitution. But each of us have to be in authority when we're given a position of authority, and we have to also be under authority. So you need to educate, and educate some more. And if you don't, you're not doing your job to pass it on to the next generation. Now, all of this I have researched on my own. In my 23 years in the party, nobody has ever taught me this. Sad to say. It's pathetic that it actually hasn't happened. They need to talk about this. They need to explain it to people. At the state convention in May of 2022, 55% of the delegates were new. At our state central committee meeting here on August 12th, about 33% of them were new. And it's not just the new people. I'll guarantee there's old people that have been there for 20 years that have never, ever even looked at all this stuff. And that's sad to say. I had pretty good history classes, pretty good civic classes when I was a kid. I graduated in 1964. And I was about the tipping point where things really started to collapse. And then I had a lot of history in college and so on. So I have an advantage, and I have a great interest in history, so I spend time actually studying statutes and studying constitutions and working and figuring this stuff out, and then trying to ask questions when it's possible. But there's very, very few people out there who are teachers to be willing to actually communicate, and this is absolutely essential. So I would urge you as a BPOU to really develop an educational wing where you're telling people this is how it goes. Now, I've come over and explained different things, and I enjoy doing that, and we can certainly help and continue. But you've got plenty of people to train in the future. Next caucus, what's going to happen? You're going to have a lot of new people. They come here and scratch your head. What's a delegate? What is all this stuff? And the same questions you guys had. So you need to start putting these things down on paper, make some presentations like this, and gradually get into it. And then hopefully those people begin to learn that they need to pass it on as well.